The movie begins with two girls named Anne and Mary, along with their brother George, who are having a blast while Sir Thomas Boleyn tells his wife Elizabeth about Mary getting engaged to William Carey. But Anne thinks Mary could do better. Now, years later, Mary, the lovely bride-to-be, is getting ready for her wedding today. Her brother and sister are here to cheer her on. Even though Mary's younger and marrying first, her sister is super happy for her. Meanwhile, Queen Catherine of Aragon has lost her baby boy during childbirth, and the kingdom might not have an heir since the king and queen only have a daughter. King Henry Tudor received the upsetting news and couldn't be comforted. At the wedding, despite William Carey not being wealthy or noble, the guests are enjoying themselves. Mary, still thrilled to marry him, doesn't mind. Meanwhile, Anne catches Henry Percy's unwavering gaze. Even though George reminds her that Henry Percy is committed, it doesn't seem to deter Anne at all. Elizabeth's brother, the Duke of Norfolk, pays a visit to discuss the king's situation with Thomas. With the queen facing another failed pregnancy, the king might seek comfort elsewhere soon. Norfolk sees an opportunity they could capitalize on. Thomas suggests Anne as a potential option. Later, after the celebrations, Anne assists her sister in preparing for her wedding night. Mary promises to share all the details in the morning before she retires to the chambers with her husband. In the morning, Anne was summoned by her father and uncle, who revealed a promising opportunity. She could bring significant wealth and social standing to their family. The king's personal life was in turmoil, and it was anticipated he might seek comfort elsewhere. If Anne could captivate Henry, their family would gain favor. Thomas later shared this plan with his wife, Elizabeth, who was apprehensive. She disliked the idea due to the immense cost of preparing for the royal visit and the potential damage to Anne's reputation. However, Thomas remained undeterred. The following day, Mary confided in her sister about the intimate events of the previous night. Anne, too, disclosed a secret. Now she was expected to entertain the King of England. Months later, Henry Tudor arrived with a grand entourage, causing excitement throughout the village. Anne felt anxious, but her sister stood by her side in support. Anne was introduced to the king, but he seemed to overlook Mary entirely. A lavish feast was hosted, with Anne seated beside Henry. That evening, her father reminded her of the importance of the following day, emphasizing that everything hinged on her making a favorable impression. The next morning, Henry, Anne, and their entourage went hunting, causing worry for Thomas when they didn't return promptly. It turned out that Henry had a serious fall while chasing a deer, suffering both physically and in pride. Mary was tasked with caring for the injured king, surprising him with her beauty that he hadn't noticed before. Before departing, Henry requested that Mary and her husband not delay in arriving at the royal court. Anne, feeling furious with her sister, believed Mary had dashed her hopes for a better future. Later, Mary learned from her father that she would become the Queen's maid of honor, and William would join the Privy Council. Despite her reluctance, Mary's husband, influenced by the Duke of Norfolk, didn't yield to her pleas, and she reluctantly became a maid of honor too. Mary pleaded with her mother to intervene, but she explained they couldn't oppose the king's will. Anne remained angry with Mary, convinced she'd deliberately captured the king's attention. Upon arrival at the royal court, the new attendants met Catherine of Aragon, who made it clear that Mary was unwelcome due to the king's interest in her. Mary encountered Jane Parker, who urged her not to hold a grudge against the queen, citing her distress over her husband's infidelities. A grand ball took place in the evening, where Jane focused on George, who didn't reciprocate her interest. William Stafford confided in Mary about his discomfort at the court. Meanwhile, Anna wasted no time and continued her flirtation with Henry Percy. The king discreetly hinted to Mary that he awaited her that night. Following the ball, a maid guided Mary to the king's chambers, where he confessed his affection for her, praising her kindness and honesty. They kissed, swept up in a moment of passion. The next morning, Stafford escorted Mary to her father and uncle, who probed into her relationship with the king. The Duke of Norfolk believed that if Mary bore a son, it would be the ultimate victory, assuming the queen wouldn't give Henry a male heir. Anne secretly married Henry Percy, prompting George to inform Mary, who feared ruin once Percy's family discovered the truth. Given Henry's binding marriage contract, Mary disclosed everything to protect Anne, with Thomas and the Duke of Norfolk agreeing to keep it hidden. Anne blamed Mary, failing to see her intentions. Their mother advised Anne to learn from French court ladies the art of getting what she wanted. Soon, Mary fell ill, and the king was delighted upon discovering her pregnancy. This meant he could appear publicly with Mary as if she were his wife. Thomas was to become a duke, George a viscount, and they received wealth and property. However, George was displeased when he learned of the king's approval of his marriage to Jane Parker, but felt he had no choice. Elizabeth was unhappy about their elevated societal status, deeming it precarious. One day, Mary woke up in pain, and the court physician advised complete rest to maintain the pregnancy. With the king unable to share a bed with Mary, the Duke of Norfolk sought ways to keep him close. Thomas thought it was time to bring him back from exile in France. Meanwhile, the mother wrote a letter to her daughter, who soon returned to England, captivating the royal court with her wit, drawing admiration from courtiers and the king. Unhappy about her sister's return, Mary feared retaliation. In the midst of this, Jane Parker lays claim to George, feeling unacknowledged as his wife. One day, the king observed Anne conversing with courtiers, having gained knowledge, and fostering scientific and philosophical pursuits. Henry found pleasure in watching Anne, and had completely lost interest in Mary. When Anne received a gift from the king but refused it, returning it through a servant, Henry was deeply outraged. Anne, for the first time since her arrival, visited Mary, asserting her relentless ambitions. In front of Mary, a servant brought another gift from the king, which Anne once again rejected. Henry, furious with her constant refusals, demanded an explanation. Anne claimed the gifts were insulting, as she couldn't betray her sister. Meanwhile, Mary went into labor, causing anxiety for Thomas and the Duke of Norfolk. The king asked Anne if he stood a chance while Mary gave birth to a son. Henry vowed never to share a bed with his wife and Mary again, and Anne hinted he might have a chance. Disregarding his newborn son, Henry left with her, leaving Anne feeling triumphant while Mary wept bitterly. The Duke of Norfolk was furious with Anne for disrupting their plan, but Anne believed the birth of the child meant nothing. She wished for Mary and her child to return to Rochford. Elizabeth believed it was Anne's responsibility to personally inform her sister, which Anne did. Boldly, she declared her intentions to become England's queen and marry Henry lawfully, prioritizing personal ambition over love. Meanwhile, Mary prepared to depart for the countryside as the king spent time with Anne, as observed by Catherine of Aragon. Anne, unsatisfied with Henry's actions, insisted that nothing could progress between them, while Catherine remained queen. Henry, determined to be with Anne, sought to find a reason to remove his wife and planned to send Catherine to a nunnery. Yet Anne wanted more. She aimed to persuade Henry to dissolve his marriage to Catherine and marry her. Thomas burst into Anne's chambers with news of Henry Percy's broken engagement due to his secret marriage to Anne. Furious, Henry distanced himself from Anne and her family, only trusting Mary, who arrived at the palace. Henry asserted that the court would scrutinize his marriage's legality. Despite her resentment, Mary assured the king of Anne's trustworthiness. Grateful, Anne and Mary sought reconciliation, agreeing to forget their past feud. Mary consented to Anne's request to stay at the palace. As preparations for Catherine's trial progressed, she faced accusations of misconduct in her previous marriage. Despite the shame, Catherine maintained dignity. The Duke of Norfolk and Elizabeth feared a rift in the country if Henry dissolved the marriage. Going against the Catholic Church, Catherine implored Henry to see through Anne's manipulation, but passion clouded his judgment. Visiting Anne, Henry demanded what she promised. Anne refused, leading to a forceful confrontation when Henry insisted on her fulfilling marital duties before marriage. Anne, wounded in pride, managed to proceed with her coronation, becoming England's queen and Henry Tudor's lawful wife. Despite a celebratory ball held in her honor, the courtiers disliked her, labeling her a witch. One day, William Stafford approached Mary, proposing they escape and marry, but she couldn't agree, fearing disgrace for her family. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, disappointing Henry, who had hoped for a son. Anne, witnessing Henry's interactions with Jane Seymour, felt betrayed. Their scandal echoed through the palace. She confided in her sister, admitting her marriage was falling apart. Her triumph relied on bearing a son. Soon, Anne became pregnant again. The Duke of Norfolk approached Jane Parker, emphasizing the family's threat if the queen didn't birth a son, urging Jane's assistance. In pain one night, Anne lied to the servants, concealing her miscarriage. She confided in her siblings about the loss, knowing if the king discovered it, he'd declare her a witch. The situation took a dark turn when Anne, driven to conceive at any cost, sought George's help despite his horror at her request. Persistent, Anne continued, shocking Mary, who hurried away. Jane witnessed her husband's encounter with Anne, leaving her stunned. George couldn't bring himself to comply. Meanwhile, Mary urgently returned to Rochford, while Jane informed the king about what she had seen. The next morning, Anne confessed the loss of their child to Henry, who accused her of witchcraft and ordered her imprisonment. George was also taken into custody. Tearful, Elizabeth confronted her husband, lamenting their children's fate due to their ambition. Stafford arrived at Rochford, sharing the news with Mary. Anne faced trial for a severe crime against God and morality, receiving a unanimous guilty verdict. George faced the scaffold, praying as the swift execution occurred, witnessed by Thomas. Mary dared to plead with the king for Anne's mercy. Surprisingly moved by Mary's plea, Henry initially promised clemency. Visiting her sister in the dungeon, Mary assured Anne of better days ahead. But just before Anne faced the scaffold, Mary received a note from the king. Henry had reversed his decision to pardon Anne. Trembling, Anna relinquished her royal symbols as the sentence was carried out that day. Mary took little Elizabeth and returned to Rochford. The narrative then follows the real characters. Thomas passed away after 2 years. The Duke of Norfolk ended up imprisoned, and Mary Boleyn found happiness with William Stafford, living away from the palace. Eventually, Elizabeth ascended to become Queen of England, reigning for 45 years. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and take care.